Morgan is unable to get on, so I'm going to chair this session this morning. Distinguished members of the forum, distinguished delegates, observers, and friends, it's my pleasure to welcome you back to the Permanent Forum this morning. Allow me to outline some organizational points before beginning our deliberations. This informal meeting is held using remote simultaneous interpretation. I kindly ask participants to be mindful of the additional difficulties experienced by interpreters when working remotely and of the increased likelihood of disruptions to the audio feed to the interpreters. I therefore request all participants to speak slowly when making their interventions. Participants may select their preferred language to hear the interpretation or choose the none option to hear the original language of the speaker. If you face audio or video issues during the meeting, please use the Restart All Lines button above the hand icon. Should the problem persist, reload your browser. For technical support, you may also send a private message to the moderator of the meeting. The chat box should not be used to request the floor. Instead, please click on the green hand next to the microphone button. Speakers will not be able to unmute their microphones or engage their video until given the floor. When called upon to speak, the speakers will receive a message indicating that their streaming is approved. Please press the video button appearing in that message in order to share your video and audio. Most importantly, if you are not speaking, please remember to mute your microphone. Thank you for your cooperation. So today, agenda item 5D, Human Rights Dialogue with the Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous People and the Expert Mechanism on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and the Voluntary Fund for Indigenous People. Distinguished members of the forum, dear colleagues, I now invite the forum to begin its consideration of agenda item 5D, Human Rights Dialogues with the Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous People and the Expert Mechanism on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and the Voluntary Fund for Indigenous Peoples. I would like to extend a warm welcome to our distinguished speakers this morning. Mr. Francisco Cali, the Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, Ms. Leila Vars, Chair of the Expert Mechanism on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and Mr. Pablo Miss, Chair of the United Nations Voluntary Fund for Indigenous Peoples. Without further ado, I invite Mr. Vital Babanzi, member of the Permanent Forum, to moderate the presentation of our distinguished speakers. Mr. Babanzi?
Merci, Monsieur Geoffrey de Macron.
Thank you for giving me the floor. I would like to hope that our chair will be able to join this meeting. Ladies and gentlemen, members of the Permanent Forum and member states here who are also at the meeting, Special Rapporteur on the Rights and Freedoms of Indigenous Peoples, also the representative, Madam Representative from MRIP, as well as the representative from the UN Voluntary Fund, and representatives of UN bodies and agencies, Indigenous peoples who are meeting with us today. Ladies and gentlemen, a very good morning to you all, and welcome to this meeting. It is very important for us to discuss this issue of human rights, and I I think we've heard how we can participate. So I would like to give the floor first of all to the Special Rapporteur on the rights and fundamental freedoms of Indigenous peoples. Mr. Special Rapporteur, you have the floor.
Monsieur le rapporteur, si vous m'entendez, vous avez la parole.
Special Rapporteur, if you can hear me, you have the floor.
Je pense que monsieur le rapporteur a un petit souci de connexion.
I think the Special Rapporteur may be having some connection problems. If he's not here, then perhaps I will give the floor to the chair of the expert mechanism as we wait for the rapporteur to join. Actually, he is here. Special Rapporteur, you have the floor. Thank you very much and welcome.
Je pense que le rapport...
I don't think we can hear the Special Rapporteur. Do you need to switch your microphone on, sir?
Vous êtes encore inaudible.
You're still on mute. We can't hear you. Ah.
Do you hear me? Okay. Madam Chairperson of the Permanent Forum, distinguished members of the Permanent Forum, Assistant Secretary General for Human Rights, Indigenous representatives, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. It is an honor for me to address for the first time since assuming my mandate, the Permanent Forum, and all those attending the interactive discussion on the human rights situation of Indigenous people today. Allow me to briefly provide an update on my work as a special rapporteur since assuming my mandate last year and to elaborate on some of the activities I have been involved in since then. I will also make a few remarks on this year's theme of the Permanent Forum on Peace, Justice, and Strong Institutions, the role of Indigenous people in implementing Sustainable Development Goal 16. I took up my role in May 2020 in the midst of the COVID-19 crisis, which has taken a severe toll on all our lives. Indigenous peoples are especially vulnerable to the disease due to inadequate access to healthcare, clean water, and sanitation, and due to their prior health conditions. This unprecedented scenario requires that I immediately focus on how COVID-19 is impacting on the situation of Indigenous communities in order to assess how it will change their lives at present and also for the future. I have engaged extensively with Indigenous peoples around the world to listen and learn how they are being affected. Throughout this past year, I have continued to receive disturbing information regarding the particular pandemic-related consequences and violations experienced by Indigenous peoples all over the globe. My first annual thematic report to the General Assembly in October 2020 analyzed the global impact of COVID-19 on the rights of Indigenous peoples. In response to a public call for information on the topic, I received over 150 submissions from Indigenous peoples and organizations, civil society, independent national institutions, academic, and experts. My report to the General Assembly provides an overview of violations of Indigenous peoples' rights caused or exacerbated by disease itself, but also by certain measures taken by the states to contain the pandemic or protect their national economies. Despite COVID-19 restrictions, companies have continued to grab land from Indigenous peoples. Consultation with indigenous people and environmental impact assessment have been abruptly suspended in order to force through mega projects relating to agribusiness, mining, dams, and infrastructures. And while private enterprises have been allowed to continue their activities and encroachment on indigenous land, in contrast, I have observed the enforcement of repressive restrictions on indigenous people's rights to freedom to expression and assembly in order to protect their lands. The escalating evictions of indigenous people from their land and the loss of their traditional livelihoods, combined with hardship of COVID-19, is aggravating extreme poverty and malnutrition in indigenous communities. For tribes in isolated locations, the virus poses an existential threat. Indigenous people have been largely neglected in contingency measures and have most countries only been included, if at all, late in the state response to COVID-19. As a result, their needs and requirements are not adequately taken into account and addressed by national programs and policies. Effective responses to the pandemic and recovery measures must be collaborative effort between indigenous institutions and state institutions. This requires combining indigenous knowledge of what is best for their own communities as well as state services and financial support. Without significantly strengthening action from the state, the COVID-19 crisis is pushing indigenous people even further behind in the realizations of the Sustainable Development Goals. Recognition of indigenous people's land rights is indispensable for the sustainable management of our planet's limited resources, and ultimately key to the survival of us all. Indigenous people, traditionally livelihoods and cultures risk becoming extinct as a state prioritize their economic interests over the internationally recognized rights of indigenous peoples. Early inclusion and participation of indigenous peoples and their institutions in contingency plan is key in order to ensure that their needs are taken into account and addressed by national recovery policies. It is also essential in order to ensure greater preparedness for future such crises. I have therefore decided to maintain focus on the importance of these issues in my next thematic report, which will be submitted to the Human Rights Council in September 2021. Madam Chair, I also wish to briefly refer to the thematic report submitted to the Human Rights Council in September by my predecessor, Ms. Tauri Corpus. The report highlights examples of positive impacts from around the world regarding strengthening protection of the rights of indigenous peoples based on the work that was carried out by mandate period 2014-2020. Among the examples highlighted are her intervention that contributed to acquittal of indigenous leaders defending the land rights of their communities. Other examples illustrated how she intervened directly with several governments and financial investors in large-scale development projects across Asia, Africa, and Latin America, and successfully urged them to suspend activities pending compliance with human rights. In some instances, her advocacy contributed to halting eviction of indigenous people from their traditional land. In other situations, she contributed to land rights litigation being decided in favor of indigenous people and the initiation of land demarcation and titling processes. The same report also considered experiences and lessons learned regarding consultation processes and puts forward recommendations on the implementation of international standards on consultation and free, prior, and informed consent. In addition, I presented a second report completed by my predecessor to the Human Rights Council in September 2020, containing an overview of the situation of indigenous people in Asia, based on a regional consultation attended by more than 100 representatives of indigenous peoples from 13 countries. This report focuses on issues relating to self-determination, governance and justice system, lands, territories and resources, conservation, climate change, business and human rights defenders, and the Sustainable Development Goals. The report raised concern over the massive displacement that indigenous face across Asia and the destruction of their environment and rising poverty due to land grabbing, large-scale development projects including dams, mining, monocrop plantation, and logging are increasing in the region and causing serious human rights violation as an indigenous peoples lost their traditional land and resources. Across the region, indigenous peoples often lack legal recognition of their status, and there is widespread failure to protect their land and respect their rights to participate and to be consulted in decisions affecting them. The report notes that the state must take measures to prevent violence and the criminalization of indigenous peoples who exercise their right in the defense of their lands and territories. A strengthening of the regulation of private companies is essential in order to disseminate a NASHA consultation report and a stated mandate engagement and exchange with stakeholders. A series of webinars were held jointly with the Asian Indigenous People Pact and the OHS-CHR Bangkok office in late 2020. Both Ms. Tauli Corpus and I participated in these webinars together with over 500 participants from across the Asian region. In terms of future thematic priorities, I will continue to focus on human rights concerning relating to land rights, the impact of COVID-19, attacks and criminalization of indigenous peoples, and the importance of indigenous knowledge in relation to conservation and climate change, as well the right of indigenous people to water. The mandate will also explore issues which require additional attention, such as challenges faced by indigenous people in urban areas, the impact of forced and bonded labor, and analysis of how environmental and social impact assessments are carried out. Madam Chair, in relation to official country visit, in March 2020, the former Special Rapporteur had initiated an official country visit to Denmark and Greenland, which unfortunately had to be interrupted due to the coronavirus pandemic. As soon as public health conditions allow, I intend to resume the visit to Greenland and Denmark, which will be my first official country visit as a Special Rapporteur. During my mandate period, I will continue to seek country visits to Asia and Africa and urge states in this region to accept requests to visit officially. My mandate also involves acting upon information of alleged violation of rights of indigenous people in a specific situation. I would like to acknowledge and thank the indigenous people and individuals who have provided information to my mandate. During 2020, I issued more than 60 communications to over 28 states and to other entities such as private corporations and intergovernmental organizations in response to information received on alleged violations of human rights of indigenous peoples. My mandate also issued numerous press releases on cases of urgency or special concerns. I would like to acknowledge the many governments that have responded to my communication regarding specific cases, and in particular those where dialogue has led to concrete actions. I am, however, still concerned that a number of governments have not responded to my communication requesting information on alleged human rights violations. I hope that in the future more countries will be open to engage in constructive dialogue with my mandate regarding particular cases. I also wish to refer to my collaboration with other UN specialized entities, regional human rights bodies, and other activities during the past year. I have continued the mandate collaboration with Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues and the Expert Mechanism on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. For instance, in November 2020, I participated in the EMBRIT seminar on the rights of Indigenous child, and in December 2020, I had the honor to contribute as a panelist to the expert group meeting on pandemics. I have maintained engagement with various United Nations agencies and participated in several webinars held by UNESCO, ILO, and UNPFII on COVID-19 impact on how to strengthen indigenous people inclusion and recovery measures. I also had the honor to speak at various events relating to racism and discrimination organized by UNESCO and WHO. In terms of cooperation with regional human rights mechanism, in April 2020, my mandate submitted writing expert testimony at the request of the African Court on Human and People's Rights on reparations in the Ogiek case. I furthermore participated in several events by regional organizations, including by the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights relating to indigenous people in isolation and COVID-19 impact in the Americas. In December 2020, I was invited to a webinar on human rights safeguards and the EU's responsibilities organized by the European Parliament. Madam Chair, before concluding, I would like to briefly refer to the theme of the year's Permanent Forum session on peace, justice, and strong institutions, the role of indigenous people in implementing Sustainable Development Goal 16. Effective access to justice for indigenous peoples imply access to both the state legal system and their own system of justice. Without accessible state courts or other legal mechanisms through which they can protect their rights, indigenous people become vulnerable to actions that threaten their lands, natural resources, cultures, sacred sites, and livelihoods. Concurrently, the recognition of indigenous people's own justice system is pivotal to ensure the right to maintain their autonomy, cultures, and traditions. The lack of effective recognition of the indigenous justice system by a state institution, coupled with ongoing discrimination against them in ordinary justice system and inadequate access to redress the reparation, are among the key challenges faced by indigenous people around the globe. It is important to underline the strengthening support for the indigenous justice system is key to promote the rule of law, achieve justice for all, and to promote effective, accountable, and inclusive institutions in a manner consistent with human rights as set out the United Nations Sustainable Development Goal 16. Madam Chair, I wish to conclude by noting that as the Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, I will draw on my previous experience, including as a grassroots indigenous leader and lifelong indigenous rights activist, and as a former member of the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. I look forward to building on the important work accomplished by my predecessors since the creations of the mandate in 2001. I remain deeply committed to my role as a special rapporteur, and I'm thankful for this opportunity to work with all of you, indigenous peoples, governments, the UN system, and other partners to promote a better future for indigenous peoples. I look forward to hearing your reflection from the floor as we discuss further. I now wish to conclude my statement, and I thank you all for your attention.
Merci.
Thank you to the Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, Mr. Francisco Calitze. Thank you for that very concise briefing. I should now like to invite the Chair of the UN Expert Mechanism on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, Ms. Leila Vars. But before giving her the floor, I would like to congratulate the mechanism on its 20th anniversary, because it has been in existence now for 20 years. And a great deal has been done during that time for Indigenous peoples. So congratulations to you, Madam. And I invite you now to take the floor. Ms. Leila Vars.
Thank you, Guido. Can you hear me?
Oui, on s'entend très bien.
Okay.
Yes, I hear you quite well.
Of the Permanent Forum, as Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, representatives of the Voluntary Fund, Indigenous representatives, excellencies, delegates, dear friends. Greetings to all friends and colleagues from the North Sami region here in Norway, the Sami territory here, I would like to thank the Permanent Forum for organizing this dialogue and providing a space for coordination between the mechanisms with a mandate to promote the rights of Indigenous peoples. Last year and also this year is unusual for us all, and is also proving to be challenging for us all as we continue to learn to live with COVID-19. The COVID-19 crisis has highlighted and continues to highlight the stark inequalities between Indigenous peoples and others in all areas of their lives. This is particularly true with respect to the lack of access to adequate healthcare and fears of inequality in accessing the COVID-19 vaccine. This differentiated and disproportionate impact of the virus on Indigenous peoples was highlighted during MRIP's 4 virtual regional meetings held in November, December last year on the subject of the impact of COVID-19 on Indigenous peoples. These virtual meetings replaced MRIP's normal annual session, and analysis of the input of all input is set out in the MRIP's annual report. And this report was submitted to the Human Rights Council in its last session in March. Other expert mechanism activities that have taken place since our last meeting in November include 2 seminars, also referred to by our dear colleague, the Special Rapporteur, in his presentation. One on the rights of the Indigenous child, held at the end of November 2020, and a second one on the right to self-determination, held in February this year. The virtual seminar on the rights of the Indigenous child was held with the collaboration of the Center for Children, Youth and Family Research of the University of Greenland. And I'm really happy to hear that the Special Rapporteur will be visiting Greenland, and I hope that he will also be able to continue the dialogue on the rights of Indigenous children in Greenland when visiting on his country mission. This seminar, as well as submissions received, informed the expert mechanism study this year on this topic, and it will be considered at the MRIP session this summer. The expert mechanism sees this study as an opportunity to integrate a human and children's rights-based approach to the interpretation of Indigenous children's rights under the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. It examines both the individual and the collective rights of Indigenous children, as well as the interplay between them, and incorporates the principle of the best interests of the child in the context of Indigenous children. It also highlights that Indigenous peoples' capacity to meet their children's needs depends on their ability to exercise their right to self-determination, and it's essential in considering existing gaps in areas like education and child welfare. Mr. Chair, in preparation for our report this year on the right to self-determination of Indigenous peoples, the University of Manitoba, with the support of MRIP, launched a virtual seminar on the topic. On the basis of this seminar and submissions received, the MRIP prepared a report on the right to self-determination as it has developed since 2007. And this report will be considered during the MRIP next session this summer. This draft report speaks to the history of the right to self-determination, including in the decolonization context. It sets out the legal framework and ways and means in which Indigenous peoples express the right to self-determination. It also explores many challenges, including the regional differences in the implementation of the right. The dangers of conflating self-determination with the requirement for free, prior, and informed consent, the imposition of self-determination by the state rather than indigenous peoples themselves, and the false dichotomy of internal and external self-determination. The report exemplifies the interconnectedness of the foundational right to self-determination and other human rights, including the rights to participation, consultation, and land rights. The relationship between the right to self-determination and citizenship, cultural heritage, sports, and languages is also covered in this report. Drafts of both of these reports will be posted on the webpage in the languages several weeks prior to in the UN languages several weeks prior to the session for discussion at the MRIP session. As to a country engagement mandate, this has provided quite challenging in the last year, given the impossibility of travel. However, we have managed to finalize a country engagement request from indigenous peoples represented by COIAB in Brazil. We undertook this engagement virtually. The advisory note provides indigenous peoples and the state with impartial, objective advice on how to protect indigenous peoples during the current crisis, given the particular situation in Brazil, including with respect to indigenous peoples' involuntary isolation. It is based on an analysis of the factual situation as provided by the parties under international human rights law. Throughout the year-long process, we were provided with information orally and in writing from indigenous peoples as well as relevant government agencies in Brazil, including the Special Secretariat of Indigenous Health, CSI, FUNAI, and the Office of the Public Defender, as well as the National Human Rights Institution, and the Articulation of Indigenous Peoples of Brazil, AIPB. The advice to the indigenous peoples of Brazil culminates in 23 recommendations relating to health measures, participation, consultation and free, prior, and informed consent, access to reliable information, including on vaccines, land rights, the removal of non-indigenous peoples from indigenous land, the protection of indigenous lands from invasion, and refraining from authorizing development projects during the crisis, the resumption of land demarcation, and the investigation of killings on indigenous land. The advisory note is a public document and can be found on our MRIP webpage. Mr. Chair, as to other country engagement requests, we already updated you on the last occasion on the finalization of a country engagement with Sweden, following a repatriation request from the IITC for the Yaki Masokova from the National Museum of World Culture in Sweden. This culminated in the parties welcoming the initiation of a process of repatriation of the Masokova and parts of the museum's Yaqui collection to the Yaqui peoples in Mexico. We have recently been informed that the process has been initiated, with Mexico making a formal request for the return of this spiritual object to the Yaqui peoples under the UNESCO Convention. We also indicated on the last occasion that we had received a positive response from Canada for a country engagement mission there in the summer or autumn of this year. We will begin the process of drafting terms of reference for this mission shortly. Several other requests remain open, including to the DRC, which had to be cancelled due to security reasons last year, Japan, Kenya, and follow-up mission to Finland, to name but a few. Several members of the expert mechanism attended the first meeting of the Global Task Force for Making a Decade of Action for Indigenous Languages on March 22nd. coordinated by UNESCO. During this meeting, they discussed draft terms of reference for the task force, an online survey to be sent to states for the preparation for the Global Action Plan and the launch of the plan. As to MRIP's session this year, it is likely that this session will be virtual, the modalities of which are yet to be worked on. For the moment, the dates remain the same from 12th to 16th of July. As to future reports, the MRIP decided that it would prepare a follow-up study to its land rights study in 2022 and a report on the issue of militarization of indigenous lands. Finally, I am happy to report that the Indigenous Peoples and Minorities section of the OHCHR has developed an e-learning tool on Indigenous peoples' rights in collaboration with the fund and the expert mechanism. This course was recently launched and is now available in English on the OHCHR website. Thank you to our dear colleagues, both the Special Rapporteur for his very good update on the many activities he is undertaking. We acknowledge your important work, and we also acknowledge and value the enhanced coordination and collaboration between our mechanisms, including the Permanent Forum and the Voluntary Fund. I look forward welcoming you to the next session of the expert mechanism in July this year. Unfortunately, we will continue to meet virtually, but let's hope that we soon will be able to meet in person and continue developing the mandates of our mechanisms. Yitu. Thank you, Chair.
Merci.
Thank you very much, Leila Suzanne Vaz, for your briefing, and we welcome this solid cooperation as we work for the rights of Indigenous peoples. I would now like to invite the chair from the Voluntary Fund for Indigenous Peoples to take the floor. I would ask him please to be brief so that the other participants who are on the list of speakers have an opportunity to speak. You have the floor, sir.
Madam Chair, the Chairperson of EMIRP, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, representatives of Indigenous peoples, civil society, international and regional organizations, Your Excellencies. I thank you for giving me the opportunity to address the 20th session of the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues on behalf of the Board of Trustees of the United Nations Voluntary Fund for Indigenous Peoples. I take this opportunity to acknowledge my esteemed colleagues in the Board of Trustees, Ms. Tuku Olsen from Greenland and Denmark, Mr. Dev Kumar Sunawar from Nepal, Ms. Marjolaine Etienne from Canada, and Mr. Dale M. Wenge from the Democratic Republic of Congo. Madam Chair, the UN Voluntary Fund on Indigenous Peoples was established in 1985, when the voices of Indigenous peoples at the United Nations was still very hushed. With a mandate that has been expanded 9 times over the past 36 years, the fund has supported the participation of over 3,000 Indigenous representatives, including women, men, youth, elders, and Indigenous persons with disabilities in many United Nations human rights mechanisms. The fund contributed significantly to important developments on Indigenous issues, from the adoption of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples to the establishment of the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, expansion of the mandate of the UN Expert Mechanism on the Rights of Indigenous People, the adoption of the 2014 World Conference of Indigenous Peoples Outcome Document, and the participation of Indigenous representatives in the General Assembly consultations on enhanced participation. Since 2020, the fund expanded its mandate to support Indigenous peoples' participation in the sessions of the UN Forum on Business and Human Rights and the UN climate change processes. In essence, we have come a long way in opening the doors of the United Nations to Indigenous peoples by increasing their participation and their visibility within the organization, by giving Indigenous peoples a voice in UN meetings which directly affect their lives. The fund contributes to increased international awareness of the rights, of the status, and of conditions of Indigenous peoples worldwide. Over the years, Madam Chair, we're increasingly seeing the result of the effective engagement of Indigenous peoples representatives in the work of the UN human rights mechanisms and other bodies, resulting in specific recommendations for the promotion, respect, and fulfillment of Indigenous peoples' rights. Madam Chair, I want to highlight that the beneficiaries of the funds are Indigenous representatives who are victims of human rights abuses, who are Indigenous human rights defenders, and those who are actively promoting positive change in laws, policies, and actions of government, or relevant actors in advancing human rights. The fund supports Indigenous representatives who otherwise would not be able to attend the meetings without the assistance provided by the fund. By participating in international fora, the grantees of the fund have been able to contribute a deep knowledge of the problems affecting Indigenous peoples to the various UN mechanisms and bodies and use international processes to address human rights violations they face at home, complementing action taken at the domestic level. In addition to providing support to enable the participation of Indigenous peoples in United Nations meetings, the fund allocates resources to build the capacities of Indigenous peoples to make them truly effective in United Nations meetings. For examples, for example, in participation with NGOs, Indigenous organizations, and members of Indigenous specific UN mechanisms, the fund regularly organizes human rights trainings, sessions in Geneva and New York, in the margins of the annual sessions of EMRIP and the Permanent Forum, to increase the capacity of Indigenous peoples representatives to effectively participate in human rights mechanisms. Most recently, the Indigenous Peoples and Minorities section of the OHCHR has developed an e-learning tool on Indigenous peoples' rights in collaboration with the fund and, as the chair of EMRIP mentioned, in collaboration with EMRIP as well. The course was recently launched and is now available in English on the OHCHR website. Through this online learning tool, participants will increase their knowledge and understanding of the rights of Indigenous peoples as recognized in UNDRIP and in other international instruments. The e-learning tool includes explanations on the key provisions of UNDRIP, real stories and case studies on how Indigenous rights are translating into real-life situations, possible actions by the United Nations mechanism, activities and quizzes, tools and resources. Once the user successfully completes the course, she or he will get a certificate from the United Nations Human Rights Office. The online course is free of charge and will be translated into other languages. Madam Chair, during 2020, although the fund allocated a total of $523,175 US dollars to support the participation of 152 Indigenous representatives to the various meetings mandated by the fund. Due to COVID-19 pandemic, a very limited number of grantees could travel in the early part of 2020. For example, 4 Indigenous representatives participated in the 84th session of the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child that took place in Samoa. This year, 2021, in view of the ongoing travel restrictions and unpredictable sanitary situation worldwide, the board decided to allocate financial resources for participation and travel grants to UN meetings taking place as of September 2021. In this unique context, and as per the approved cost plan of 2021, the board recommends to allocate $141,625 US dollars for travel related purposes of Indigenous representatives to the following UN meetings: 15 grants to participate in the session of the UN Human Rights Council and its UPR, including the session of the UN treaty bodies in Geneva; 15 grants to participate in the session of the UN Forum on Business and Human Rights in Geneva; and 21 grants to participate in meetings of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. Madam Chair, the uncertainty about the future contributions continues to impact the delivery of our mandate. The numerous expansions of the mandate of the fund created new opportunities for Indigenous peoples to voice their concerns at the UN, which is extremely positive, but it also means increasing demands for support. The work of the fund is supported by means of voluntary contributions from governments, non-governmental organizations, and other private or public entities. The fund would not be in a position to carry out its mandate without sustainable financial support. In this regard, and on behalf of the Board of Trustees, I would like to express our deepest gratitude and appreciation to the governments of Australia, Chile, Estonia, Finland, Germany, the Holy See, Mexico, Norway, and Peru for their generous contribution to the voluntary fund in 2020. Madam Chair, we must strive to pursue our collective efforts towards the full participation of those most directly affected and thus seek to achieve the effective realization of Indigenous peoples' rights as enshrined in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. With particular reference to paragraph 38 of the outcome document of the World Conference, I would like to appeal to all governments and also private entities to consider supporting the vital work of the UN Voluntary Fund for Indigenous Peoples. I thank you, Madam Chair.
Merci, Monsieur Pablo.
Thank you very much, Pablo, for your presentation and for the information you've provided on your work and the specific work of the Voluntary Fund. Now, before I give the floor to speakers, I would like to ask one of my member colleagues if they wish to take the floor, if any members of the forum wish to ask any questions. I would also now like to give the floor to Madame Lourdes, followed by Irma. Madame Lourdes, can you hear me? If so, you have the floor.
Hola, hola. Buenos días.
Hello, good morning, everyone. Thank you for giving me the floor, but I didn't raise my hand to speak this morning.
Merci. Irma va prendre.
Thank you. In that case, Irma, followed by Ms. Annan. Irma, if you can hear me, you have the floor.
Así es, muchas gracias.
Yes, thank you very much. Greetings from Mexico. On behalf of those participating in this forum from Latin America and the Caribbean, I would say that we are quite concerned about the human rights issues facing Indigenous peoples. This affects the implementation of the rights of Indigenous peoples and leads to the systematic violation of their rights. We cannot speak about peace and justice while these rights to life, land, the environment, and Indigenous cultures continue to be violated. We therefore request that this forum recommend to states, 1, the implementation of the ILO 169 Convention, the Declaration on the Indigenous Peoples by the United Nations, and the Inter-American Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples in all of the public policies and norms which are established. 2, that we continue with dialogue and agreement as a means of solving problems and reaching agreements about the human rights of Indigenous peoples. And 3, that the gender-based rights are recognized and that they are protected from any form of violence, discrimination, or exclusion based on their gender, ethnic origin, religion, race, or other form. Thank you very much. That's all.
Merci. Maintenant.
Thank you. I will now invite Ms. Hanan to take the floor, followed by Ms. Hindu. Thank you.
Hanan,
Hanan? Okay, Hindu, go ahead, and then we'll move on to Hanan afterwards.
Merci beaucoup, Vital. Thank you very much. For all your presentations, I have few comments to make. In Africa, as you know, that COVID created a lot of human rights violation, especially the women right and young girls. So many of the young girls in East Africa ended by being pregnant, and then no one is talking about them health rights, and no one is talking about the violation of the women rights there. So then we know that the access to information about COVID have been very complicated. So access to information is a human right, and then communities do not have this chance to understand and then to also protect themselves from what's happening. So indigenous communities did that themselves, but not from the government. The discrimination is still going very up there. And during the COVID time, the closing of the frontiers create a natural resources conflict between the communities because, for example, as pastoralists, we cannot cross the border for the pastures or water, and then that create a tension between the communities. And what we are asking for that MRIP and then special rapporteurs, maybe you can conduct and lobbying, asking for equal access to information and equal access to vaccine, to recognize also their rights and knowledge of indigenous peoples. The second point is on land right. We are seeing the conflict that's happening on indigenous people's land, and especially last months we do have a conflict on DRC where the indigenous peoples was delocated and many of them getting dead just with the rebellions there and the militaries armies who was in conflict there. And also the Sahel regions, as you all know, the communities that fighting to access the natural resources, and then also the conflict around other military groups in the indigenous people's land. So if the MRIP and the special rapporteurs can conduct and study around the indigenous peoples and access to the land right and resources around those regions, it will be very important. And we are calling for the country visit on these regions. The other point is around the participations. With the COVID, as you see all the meetings going virtually, indigenous peoples of Africa do not have access even to the electricity, and the now to the internet is becoming a big issue, and there is no at all participations of indigenous peoples around the international meetings. So we are calling to the voluntary fund. While the meetings are in person, they are funding the peoples who can get access to the countries and who can get access to the hotels and all. So we are calling that to support the participation of the indigenous peoples as right-based approach during those virtual meetings by paying at least the access to the internet. They are not asking for the ticket, they are asking only to the internet in order to participate. I'm ending by the positive note. We are so grateful that there is also Burundi who nominate a human rights ministries, and that joining also other countries in Africa like Chad and others who have the Ministry of Human Rights, how you can work with them to highlight the indigenous people's issues. And we are also so grateful in DRC, they adopted last week's the law on indigenous people's rights. And of course, the decentralization of the fellowship program is so helpful to have them at the national and the regional level. So we are calling for those kind of initiatives to be continuous. Thank you so much, Chair.
Merci.
Thank you, Hindu, for your intervention. Apologies for not seeing Ms. Hannah. And this will be followed by Alexei. Apologies for the pronunciation. Ms. McLeod, you have the floor first.
Thank you, Chair, and to all the speakers. And I'm very happy, especially to hear about the forthcoming report of MRIP concerning the rights of our Indigenous children. One of the key issues for Indigenous children in Australia and the Pacific, in particular New Zealand, Aotearoa, is the contemporary removals of Aboriginal and Māori children from their families and from their communities and lands. We have a long history in our country associated with colonisation concerning the forced removal of Aboriginal children, which in Australia was found to amount to cultural genocide by the National Human Rights Institution in their important report, Bringing Them Home. One of the key recommendations of that inquiry was to ensure self-determination in out-of-home care protection laws. And they recommended that in future that Aboriginal people be responsible for childcare and protection laws, that jurisdiction be transferred to Aboriginal people. It's very sad in Australia that this has not largely happened. There is only one state, a progressive state, Victoria, which has ensured that this has now happened for Aboriginal children. And we have had an official policy by a former Prime Minister, Kevin Rudd, for the stolen generation people. And he has followed this up with another warning because of the very high levels of removals of Aboriginal children that's continuing to this day. We have laws that do not respect Aboriginal self-determination in out-of-home care. Currently, there is such a law in the West Australian Parliament, and we are calling for best practice in this law and for models such as Aboriginal family-led decision-making, which are very critical. Another campaign that is very important in Australia at this time concerning children is the Raise the Age campaign, because very sadly, children as young as 10 years old can be found to be criminally responsible and are being incarcerated. And these are largely, if not all, Indigenous children who are being subjected to these very harsh laws, which are traumatic, which are being condemned across the country, including by the peak organisation for doctors in the country, because of the harmful effects on the Indigenous children. There are some very important human rights responses that need to happen in our country. We need to ensure self-determination is respected in out-of-home care law and with regards to our Indigenous children. We also should appoint Aboriginal Children's Commissioners in all territories, and this has been a recommendation of UN treaty bodies, including the Committee on the Rights of the Child. We need all of our states and our territories and our federal government to increase the age of criminal responsibility as recommended by the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child from 10 to a minimum age of 14 years. Australia should also sign the optional protocol to the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which will allow Indigenous children whose human rights are violated to take their complaint to the United Nations treaty body to be heard. Thank you.
Merci.
Thank you.
Remember, that'd be great. Thanks.
Yeah. Merci, Alex.
Thank you, Alexei.
Thank you very much, Mr. Vice Chair. I would like to thank you very much for the system mechanisms, for the very fruitful and impressive work during the challenging conditions of the pandemic. Very briefly, questions for the colleagues. Given the need for our respective mandates to conduct constant cooperation and avoid overlapping, I have one question to each of the mandate. I would like to ask the special rapporteur on how he could outline the possible priorities and areas of cooperation of his mandate with the Permanent Forum during the upcoming International Decade for Indigenous Languages. I would also like to ask the chair of the expert mechanism whether there are ways of cooperation between our mandates, as EMRIP is following up on the country engagement cases, especially in those cases where states are not responsive. Could the Permanent Forum be of any assistance to facilitate this process? And I also would like to join my sister Hindu in asking the Voluntary Fund whether there are any elaborations on more flexibility in terms of different types of engagements of Indigenous peoples with the UN processes, including remote participation and seeking good internet connections. Thank you very much.
I want to thank my distinguished colleague and fellow forum member, Mr. Vital Babanzi, for moderating the presentation and moderating the session with the permanent forum members. I really appreciate that. I want to thank my colleagues as well on the forum for their comments. It's my intention to revert back to the speakers at the end of this morning's meeting in order to address any issues that were raised in the interventions from observers during the general discussion under this item. So now I want to invite the permanent forum to begin its general discussion of agenda item 5D. Before beginning the floor to the first speaker, before giving the floor to the first speaker, I'd like to remind participants to kindly limit their interventions to no more than 2 minutes. The microphone will be automatically muted when the allotted speaking time has elapsed. I would accordingly encourage all participants to submit the full version of their statement to e-statements for inclusion into the record of this meeting in the Journal of the United Nations. I would also like to ask participants to kindly raise the green hand next to your microphone button when I call upon you in order to allow the Secretariat to locate you and begin your streaming. Finally, I request all speakers to deliver their interventions at a reasonable speed in order to facilitate the work of our interpreters. Thank you for your understanding and cooperation. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Denmark on behalf of the Nordic countries, to be followed by representatives of the European Union. Denmark, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for the floor. I have the honor of speaking on behalf of Finland, Iceland, Norway, Sweden, and my own country, Denmark, together with Greenland. First, let me say we appreciate very much the opportunity to engage with both of these important axes within the field of rights of indigenous peoples. Mr. Tsai, I would like to start by thanking you for your work undertaken during this last year. I mean, this work is of great importance, and we really look forward to continuing the engagement and cooperation with you. The Nordic countries are committed to ensuring respect for the rights and cultures of indigenous peoples, and we appreciate very much your efforts to shed light on the impact of the coronavirus on the individual and collective rights of indigenous peoples. In your report, you highlight that precautionary measures adopted by states to control the coronavirus do not always acknowledge, accommodate, or respect indigenous peoples' practices, traditions, and customs. In this regard, the Nordic countries would like to ask you, Mr. Tsai, whether you could elaborate on how states should design precautionary measures in order to respect and accommodate indigenous practices, traditions, and customs, such as community living practices, while effectively protecting residents from infection. Distinguished members of the expert mechanism on the rights of indigenous peoples, the Nordic countries, including Greenland, would like to thank you for all your work regarding rights of indigenous peoples. The Nordic countries note with appreciation your latest study regarding land rights of indigenous peoples and your latest reports on repatriation of ceremonial objects, human remains, and intangible cultural heritage. In your report regarding repatriation, you touch upon the importance of establishing meaningful relationships with museums as a contribution to the healing of past injustices and the protection and intergenerational transmission of indigenous peoples' living cultures. I mean, thus, for us, the Nordic countries, we'd very much like to ask you what measures states can actually take to facilitate the establishment of meaningful relationships between indigenous peoples and museums. I thank you.
I thank the member from Denmark on behalf of the Nordic countries. I now give the floor to the representative of the European Union, and followed by the representative from the International Treaty Council.
Thank you very much.
You have the floor, European Union.
I want to pay tribute to all representatives who stand up for and represent the rights of indigenous people. Respect for these rights, as set out in UNPFII, is a shared value within the European Union and forms part of our commitment to protect and promote human rights. The EU fully shares the concerns on how the pandemic has hit indigenous communities around the world. Indigenous peoples, in particular women and girls, are disproportionately affected by health crisis, as many live in isolated or remote communities where healthcare services are difficult to reach, have limited capacity, or simply do not exist. These inequalities have been exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic, as we've heard, and have seriously limited full enjoyment of human rights by indigenous people. The response to COVID-19 must therefore take into account the rights of indigenous peoples as set out in the UNDRIP, including the right to the highest attainable standard of physical and mental health, universal and equitable access to quality health services, including vaccines, must be ensured. We also need to ensure the effective and meaningful participation and leadership of indigenous peoples in recovery instruments and policies. The EU is fully committed to supporting the rights of indigenous peoples and set out in UNDRIP and in its response to COVID-19 in accordance with the EU's Council conclusions on indigenous peoples from May 2017 and the EU guidelines for human rights defenders. We note with concern that indigenous human rights defenders have experienced an increase in the attacks and intimidation against them during the pandemic. These acts are unacceptable and those responsible must be held accountable. I have a question, and that is, in your view, what are the biggest challenges to ensuring that the rights of indigenous peoples are respected and protected, especially due to the COVID-19 pandemic? Thank you very much.
I'd like to thank the representative of the European Union. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the International Indian Treaty Council, and to be followed by the representative from New Zealand.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chair. The IITC, Yaqui Nation cultural leaders, and traditional authorities once again thank the MRIP for its very significant and successful country engagement, which brought us together with the Swedish Museums of World Culture to achieve their commitment for the repatriation of our sacred Masokova. Although the pandemic has caused a delay, we trust this will be carried out soon. We also thank the Swedish, Mexican, and Sami governments for their support in bringing about this long-awaited spiritual healing. The MRIP's engagement produced advances for other indigenous peoples engaged in repatriation efforts as well, notably the recognition of indigenous peoples' own laws governing the use and treatment of our sacred items in accordance with Article 11 of the UN Declaration. We also express our appreciation for the work of Special Rapporteur Francisco Calizay, who began his mandate in May 2020, just as the COVID-19 pandemic was reaching its greatest impacts in our nations and communities. We thank him for his study on the pandemic's impacts on indigenous people's rights, and we encourage states to implement his recommendations for the direct participation of indigenous peoples in developing relevant policies and practices. We also thank him for his response to IITC's 2020 urgent action regarding human rights defender Nick Tilson and ongoing treaty violations in Ochete-Sacoan territory, South Dakota, USA. We happily report that the charges were dropped against Mr. Tilson. However, the rapporteur's call for a bilateral process to resolve treaty violations has not yet been implemented by the U.S. We conclude by asking the rapporteur if he plans a follow-up study related to COVID-19 and when he plans to launch the greatly anticipated study on indigenous people's right to water. Thank you. Jokwe Utesia.
I now give the floor to the distinguished representative from New Zealand, and to be followed by the representative from the Fund for the Development of Indigenous Peoples of Latin America and Caribbean. We can't hear you. Are you on mute? So I think we'll go to the next speaker, and maybe we could figure that out. So let's go to the Fund for the Development of the International People for Latin America and Caribbean, followed by Indigenous Information Network.
Señor presidente.
Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, allow me to extend a brotherly greeting on behalf of FILAC as the Technical Secretary. I have a few recommendations to make to develop actions which will be culturally relevant and comprehensive. FILAC notes with concern the lack of implementation and the lack of effective mechanisms to guarantee inclusion, participation, representation, and recognition of the distinct systems of Indigenous people in the design and implementation of public policies to guarantee that no one is left behind. We call for priority attention to be given to vaccinating Indigenous peoples against COVID-19. Vaccination campaigns must be carried out in full respect of the individual and collective rights of Indigenous peoples, including prior, free, informed consent and recognition, cultural recognition. Yesterday, the adoption by the Ibero-American Institute of Indigenous Languages under the Ibero-American Summit is an important contribution to protecting and revitalizing Indigenous languages on the eve of the International Decade of Indigenous Languages. We must work to ensure its implementation through a holistic human rights approach. Mr. President, all of this requires coordinated action with Indigenous peoples. There must be a dialogue of understanding with the leaders, and FILAC will continue to work along these lines. We welcome the efforts and the work done by the Special Rapporteur, the expert mechanism, the forum, and everyone who is working for a more dignified life for our Indigenous peoples in our region and throughout the world. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I thank the representative of FILAC. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Indigenous Information Network, to be followed by the representative of Chile. Seems that they are not here, so let's move on to the representative from Chile.
Marri, compute.
I am honored as the Minister for Social Development and the Family to lead the delegation of Chile at the 20th session of the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. As the government of the President Sebastián Piñera and as their representative, we are convinced that Chile is building on our wealth based on the diversity of our culture. After a year of proceedings, the Chamber of Deputies and the Senate adopted constitutional reform, which has modified our founding charter in order to reserve seats for representatives from the indigenous populations to be members in the constituent body. On the 23rd of December 2020, the President enacted this into law. And this has become a historic day, particularly for the indigenous peoples of Chile. Undoubtedly, this date will be recorded for future generations, because despite our differences, the determination of our people, of our president, and the various political sectors allowed a new constitution to be written by indigenous peoples, by the 10 peoples living in our national territory: Mapuche, Aymara, Rapa Nui, Licanantai, Quechua, Kola, Diaguita, Kaweskar, Yagan, and Changa. Chile has joined countries of the world which have included in their constitution democratically elected indigenous representatives. As the government of Chile, we are deeply satisfied that we are supporting this unprecedented initiative, which includes 17 indigenous representatives in our constitutional convention. For the first time in history, the various indigenous peoples will engage with us face to face and will build our future constitution.
Thank you. And I thank the representative from Chile. Let's go back, and I'd like to now give the floor to the distinguished representative of New Zealand. We're still not hearing you. Unfortunately. Let's see if we can figure that out and we can come back. Next up, let's go to, I'd like to give the floor to the distinguished representatives of the Asian Indigenous Peoples Pact, followed by Canada, the representatives from Canada.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I, on behalf of the Asia Indigenous Peoples Caucus and the Asia Indigenous Peoples Pact, would like to acknowledge the commendable work of the Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and the EMRI for recommending and suggesting redressal to ameliorate the human rights condition and protect the collective rights of Indigenous peoples. In the Asia region, AIPP, in collaboration with the UN Special Procedures Office and the OHCHR Southeast Asia Subregional Office, conducted 3 rounds of webinar series from 2020 to 2021 with the Special Rapporteur based on the previous Special Rapporteur's report on Asia. However, the human rights condition of the indigenous peoples is not improving and has been remained our biggest concern. Even during this COVID-19 pandemic, militarization and dominance over the indigenous people's land and territory has increased. Development projects continue without free, prior, and informed consent. Businesses, particularly those involving exploitation of natural resources, have incited criminalizations and attacks on indigenous peoples in Asia. Some examples are the military coup in Myanmar, the 5-star Marriott hotel construction plan in Bandarban Hill district of Bangladesh, and the Build, Build, Build program in the Philippines. Mr. Chair, autonomy and self-determination are crucial for the survival and continuity of indigenous peoples and contribute to the SDGs and as dignified peoples. It is therefore important that states adopt a pluralistic approach to build synergy between state laws and institutions and indigenous laws and institutions for peaceful coexistence, a mandated theme of STRIP and EMRI for studies and recommendations. We would like to raise following questions to the Special Rapporteur and the EMRI Chair. Number 1, how can your good office support or provide an avenue, especially in terms of constructive and effective engagement with governments, intergovernmental organizations, and relevant international bodies and agencies to protect indigenous people's human rights in the Asia region? Number 2, how and to what extent can your good office facilitate peace processes in the resolving conflicts in indigenous people's lands and territories? Our question to the UN Voluntary Fund: how does the UNVF address and or expand the mandate to support for the needs of indigenous people's human rights defenders, including
I thank the distinguished representative from Asia Indigenous Peoples Pact. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Canada, and that will be followed by the representative from Ukraine.
Thank you, Chair. Canada commends the Special Rapporteur for calling our attention to the grave impact of the pandemic on the health, well-being, and livelihoods of Indigenous peoples. The pandemic has exacerbated the inequality, systemic discrimination, and marginalization experienced by Indigenous peoples around the world. This is especially the case for Indigenous women, girls, and LGBTQIA+ people. We must redouble our efforts to ensure that every Indigenous person can live with dignity. Nous accueillons favorablement.
We welcome these recommendations for a inclusive post-pandemic recovery. In Canada, we are fully committed to work closely with First Nations, Inuit and Métis communities, while in the short term we're fighting COVID-19, and in the long term we're drawing up solutions that are based on Indigenous language and traditional knowledge.
To have contributed towards MRIP's forthcoming study on the rights of the Indigenous child and the report on self-determination. The Government of Canada is committed to advancing meaningful reconciliation and accelerating the renewal of the Crown's relationship with Indigenous peoples based on an affirmation of rights, respect, and partnership.
Canada recognises that the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is a key tenet in order to work on reconciling and rebalancing relations between the state and Indigenous peoples. We remain determined to adopt a law that will be drafted in collaboratively to implement the declaration.
International level, we are keen to engage in exchange best practices and learn from each other's experience to ensure that our pandemic responses meaningfully engage and involve Indigenous peoples. Given your work with member states, are there practices you could share on how best to engage during a pandemic? Thank you very much.
I want to thank the representative from Canada. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Ukraine, and to be followed by the representative from Yakutia, our opinion.
Thank you so much, dear brothers and sisters. Madam Chair, Ukraine and my country has strived to live up to the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and I personally can attest to this by representing here not only the Ukrainian government, but also the Crimean Tatar indigenous people. I'm glad that with the recent approval of a plan for the development of a Crimean Tatar language, Ukraine will join the International Decade of Indigenous Languages beginning next year. While having ever more possibilities for self-realization throughout Ukraine, the Crimean Tatar community suffers from the Russian occupation of Ukraine's Crimea. This year focus on SDG 16 is more than timely because it sheds light on how aggression, occupation can threaten the very existence of indigenous peoples. Repressive campaigns in Crimea target mostly Crimean Tatars, leading to their displacement, such a grim reminder of Soviet deportation of Crimean Tatar people in 1944, when almost half of Crimean Tatar people died because of hunger and diseases. Today, anti-extremism and anti-terrorism law is misused to criminalize the Crimean Tatars as a whole. The Majlis of the Crimean Tatar people, our representative body, still banned despite the ICJ decision of April 2017. 2 days ago, chief editor of Kırım newspaper was fined in Crimea for publishing a report mentioned the Majlis, where the UN Secretary General called to lift this ban. Other Crimean Tatar media like the ATR channel, Lale, the TV channel for kids, and many more were forced to leave a couple of years ago. Furthermore, last month, Russians enacted a decree depriving Ukrainian citizens of a right to own land, the basis of indigenous people's identity. In addition to the relocation of about 500,000 of its population to the occupied territories, Russia's neo-colonization aims to change the demography of
We thank the representative from the Ukraine. Now we would like to call the representative of the distinguished representative from Yakutia. Followed by the representative from Guatemala. If that representative isn't there, we'll move on to the representative from Guatemala, followed by the representative from Organzis, Pribumi, Payu Barat.
Buenos días en mi lengua materna.
That was good morning in Maya Mum, my mother tongue. Mr. Chairman, the state of Guatemala welcomes the appointment of Francisco Calilay as the Special Rapporteur for the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. For Guatemala, this is a very important step forward for someone from our country to reach such a high-level post. We also welcome the work done by the Special Rapporteur in 2020 on the thematic issue, namely the repercussions, the fallout of the COVID-19 pandemic on Indigenous peoples. It is a danger to our health, to our resilience, and to the entire country. We recognize that there are special thematic procedures that are being addressed to ensure the rights of Indigenous peoples, and Indigenous peoples must be part of that process. We call on the expert mechanism to continue to suggest thematic studies to work with global actors to protect and promote the rights of Indigenous peoples, always promoting dialogue. Similarly, we invite member states of the United Nations to do more specifically to support the rights of Indigenous peoples so that we can fully implement the Declaration of the United Nations on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Finally, we would call on the expert mechanism to keep the channels of communication open so that timely information can be provided to allow for cooperation on the various studies on Indigenous peoples. Thank you.
I'd like to thank the representatives of Guatemala, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Organzis, Pribuma Payu Barat, and I apologize for the pronunciation, please correct me, to be followed by representatives of Australia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I am from Organisasi Pribumi Papua Barat. We call it West Papua Indigenous Organization, and now we change to West Papua Liberation Organization, and we join organization, and now we call West United Liberation Movement for West Papua.
So, yeah, unfortunately, we seem to have lost sound. Hopefully, we can get that back. Let's move on to the representative from Australia, followed by the representative from the Sami Council. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and I'm very pleased to say that Australia is committed to equitable access to justice for all Indigenous Australians. Sadly, however, Indigenous Australians experience disproportionately high rates of contact with the justice system. Australia recognises this issue cannot be considered in isolation from historical and socio-economic factors which Australia's Closing the Gap agreement seeks to ameliorate. As part of our nation's journey to reconciliation, Australia is committed to supporting a process of local truth-telling. The core element of do no harm will inform Australia's process of local truth-telling. The Healing Foundation, a national Indigenous organisation, partners with communities to address the ongoing trauma caused by historical injustices. One project in the Northern Territory supports Indigenous men through healing activities to gain confidence to take up employment and overcome issues such as family violence, incarceration, poor health and poor wellbeing. Australia also supports Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities to improve justice and community safety outcomes. Reducing violence against women and their children, especially Indigenous women, is a particular priority of all Australian governments. Breaking the cycle of violence requires community-driven, trauma-informed approaches that prioritise cultural healing and family restoration. The National Plan to Reduce Violence Against Women and Their Children, 2010-2022, establishes the collective action of all governments. Indigenous sentencing courts across Australia allow Indigenous elders and community members to participate in culturally appropriate court processes. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander legal services, family violence prevention legal services, and custody notification services deliver culturally safe support for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples in contact with the justice system. We acknowledge the time has come to have an honest conversation around the factors driving Indigenous incarceration.
I want to thank the representative from Australia, and now we will give the floor to the distinguished representative from the Sami Council, to be followed by the representative from Brazil.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I greet you from Sápmi, and I speak on behalf of the Arctic Caucus, consisting of the Sami and Inuit. We want to emphasize UN member state responsibility to implement Indigenous people's rights, and we welcome Canada's consideration of Bill C-15 to implement the UN Declaration at the national level. Yet, in Sápmi, there are 3 recent decisions that have not been implemented. The Supreme Court ruling of the Girjas case in Sweden, the decision from UN Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, CERD, on the case of Rönnbäcken mining project in Sweden, the decision from UN Human Rights Committee on the case of Sami Parliament electoral roll in Finland. And the implementation of these decisions has not progressed as expected. And we know that there are many more examples to be found all over the Indigenous world. Because of lack of concrete progress in the realization of the rights of the Indigenous peoples, December 2020, the International Law Association Committee on Implementation of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples specifically calls on states to fully comply with their obligations relating to Indigenous peoples' rights, and underscored the need for states to enhance their domestic legislation in the field of Indigenous peoples' rights, as well as removal of all social, cultural, structural, and institutional obstacles hindering the realization of such rights. The Arctic Caucus recommend the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues to emphasize that governments must comply with decisions by domestic courts and international human rights treaty bodies and implement Indigenous peoples' rights. Thank you for your attention. Ologito.
I would now like to give the floor to the distinguished representative of Brazil, followed by the representative of the Asocio dos Povo Indigenous Caripuna.
Distinguished Mr. Chair, members of the forum, Mr. Special Rapporteur, Madam Chair of the Expert Mechanism, and fellow delegates. First, I'd like to greet everyone and say that we took note of the recommendations made by the Expert Mechanism, as well as concerns shared by previous speakers. Brazil recognizes the challenges to properly monitor regions that are frequently have dimensions as vast as some countries with dense vegetation and difficult access. At the same time, as one of the only 23 countries that have ratified ILO Convention 169, Brazil is working together with Indigenous peoples to ensure adequate access to healthcare, medicines, vaccines, and medical equipment while respecting the traditional knowledge and cultural heritage. As an example of this commitment, we'd like to share a few initiatives that have taken place in the last year. 306 actions of patrol and fiscalizations were made in 221 indigenous lands to prevent invasion of loggers and gold miners. $4 million were directed to land protection in indigenous lands. $9.4 million were invested in anticipatory actions to prevent degradation of indigenous lands. 60% of the indigenous peoples are already fully vaccinated against COVID-19. 600,000 food kits and 170,000 hygiene kits were distributed to tackle food insecurity during the pandemic. $5 million were invested in ethno development policies to help preserve indigenous cultures and their ways of life, and a ban on all requests of authorizations to enter indigenous lands to prevent illegal invasion. I thank you.
I'd like to thank the representative of Brazil. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Association dos Povos Indigenous Caripuna, followed by the representative from the Human Rights Watch.
Mi nombre es Adriano.
My name is Adriano Caripuna. I am speaking on behalf of my people at this forum. The indigenous lands in Brazil are being encroached upon. Violations are carried out against us by the Brazilian government. Our rights have been violated, and there has been an increase in violence and death of our leaders. Institutions have been used to violate the rights of indigenous peoples. With regard to demarcation, titling, and protection of our indigenous lands. I am coming here to denounce the Brazilian government for non-compliance of constitutional laws on the right to life, to land, and public policies. I'm appealing to this permanent forum, to the expert mechanism and the special rapporteur to contact representatives of the Brazilian government as an urgent priority, to have them promote structural actions to support institutions and promote demarcation, protection, and oversight of indigenous lands in compliance with Articles 231 and 232 of our Constitution. We cannot accept this political genocide by the government, Bolsonaro, to continue here. Thank you.
I thank the representatives from the Association dos Povos Indigenous Caripuna. I now give the floor to the distinguished representatives of Human Rights Watch, to be followed by the representatives of Venezuela.
Muchas gracias, señor presidente. Mi nombre es Sonero.
Thank you very much. I'm an indigenous lawyer in Venezuela. I'm speaking on behalf of the indigenous peoples for Human Rights Watch. The High Commissioner has published in a number of reports about the humanitarian crisis in Venezuela and the serious systematic violations of human rights of the indigenous communities and peoples. He has pointed out that the indigenous people are facing challenges disproportionately and differentiated from other threats. There have been attacks against our indigenous leaders by security forces and organized criminal gangs. Our peoples have been displaced from their national territory. They suffer inhuman, cruel treatment. Indigenous peoples deserve to have prior informed consent so that they can continue to live out their lives in accordance with our traditions. This has had a negative impact on our health. The indigenous peoples have the right to a dignified and safe life, and it should be included in our Constitution. Due to the pandemic, the indigenous people have suffered even more. We support the recommendations, therefore, made by the Special Rapporteur, in particular, the recommendation on the rights of Indigenous peoples submitted to the Human Rights Council. There must be recognition of the violation of our human rights and attacks against Indigenous leaders and groups. The Venezuelan state must urgently vaccinate the Indigenous peoples to ensure our very survival. Thank you.
I thank the representative from the Human Rights Watch, and I now give the floor to Venezuela, and followed by the representatives from New Zealand's Human Rights Commission. If Venezuela's not there, I think we move on to New Zealand's Human Rights Commission, followed by the representatives from Nicaragua.
Thank you for the floor. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for the floor, tēnā koutou katoa. Greetings, Madam Chair and all esteemed participants. I make this statement on behalf of Te Kāhui Tika Tangata, the New Zealand Human Rights Commission. I would like to reiterate our thanks to the expert mechanism for its visit to New Zealand in 2019 and for its valuable advice to support the development of a national action plan for the declaration. Since then, a ministerial working group was appointed and produced its report in late 2019. The report has a strong focus on the right to self-determination and tino rangatiratanga. It emphasises the critical importance of a national action plan being developed in an authentic partnership between the government and Māori through co-design, co-governance and co-determination in order to secure the spiritual, mental, physical and relational well-being of our children, peoples, non-human relatives, lands and waterways. Further government decisions on the report were delayed with the advent of COVID-19, which while under control in New Zealand remains a threat, including through amplification of inequities. We look forward to momentum and progress on the action plan resuming and welcome the New Zealand Government's continued commitment to the development of a national action plan. I thank the Aotearoa Independent Monitoring Mechanism, which has consistently and strongly advocated for the declaration and for progress on a national action plan. Te Kāhui Tika Tangata looks forward to continuing to work collaboratively with the government, the Independent Monitoring Mechanism and others to progress this much needed work. To this end, Te Kāhui Tika Tangata has been developing a series of papers and information materials to support public awareness and engagement in the development of an action plan. Thank you, Chair. Tēnā koutou katoa.
I thank the distinguished member from the New Zealand Human Rights Commission, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Nicaragua. Is Nicaragua available? So if not, I think we will move on. We have just heard the last speaker in the general discussion for this morning. Those participants inscribed on the list who were unable to speak due to the time limitations have the option of submitting their statements in writing to the Secretariat at bellu@un.org for posting on the website of the Permanent Forum. I'd now like to give the floor to our distinguished speakers to respond to the comments made by the members from the Permanent Forum, as well as to the interventions from observers during the general discussion. And we have just a little over 13 minutes for all three of you, as well as for my colleague on the Permanent Forum. So if you could please limit your remarks to just a few minutes, I'd really appreciate it. So first will be Mr. Francisco Colli.
President, I believe that there have been several questions that there was or have been addressed to myself, to my mandate, but I will just say that, for example, the study for water, I think that it's going to be for next year, because this year we have already planned the thematic studies. And also the good practices or the positive practices, how to prevent the COVID-19 in on indigenous community. It has been proved that when a state recognize self-determination for indigenous people, has been able, the good practice of indigenous people to prevent the pandemic enter to their communities. And I believe that another issue is that a state has to take in account not only in the preventive measures, but also in the policy making decision for the policy that is going to prevent that pandemic. And I think that the access of land is something that has been historically affected indigenous people, and I believe that that is something that is really important that all mechanisms has to deal with. And of course, the other issue is that there are indigenous people who are living in borders, who are needed, or they had been before the pandemic free to move from one country to another country, and has been shown also that in those areas indigenous people have been taking care very well themselves, and that there are almost 0 cases of coronavirus. So what we have to do is not to put all the measures to all the countries through indigenous people as a whole. So we have to study one case by case. So the thing is that there are many issues that we have to do in these cases. Those are just some of the questions that I remember in this moment. So thank you very much, President, and I appreciate the questions by state and organizations.
Great, thank you very much, and I appreciate you being here. And Ms. Leila Vars.
Thank you. There was a number of questions to the expert mechanism. I'm not able to answer all of them, but I would use my very limited time to just encourage those states who are currently developing national action plans for the implementation of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples to continue their efforts. And I would like other states also to follow their example. It would be really interesting to hear more about the situation in New Zealand, where the government has very clearly engaged with the expert mechanism in a dialogue for developing a national action plan in collaboration with the Indigenous peoples and other representatives of human rights institutions. I personally find that initiative and the work that's done in Aotearoa very interesting, and we would, of course, be interested in coming back to see the progress. Questions relating to how we can, what our main advice would be for states and indigenous peoples at this moment in this particular circumstances, I think we should focus on the country engagement part of the expert mechanism mandate, encourage indigenous peoples organizations and state government representatives to use fully that part of our mandate, engage with us, and we will be able to facilitate dialogue for the implementation of indigenous peoples' rights. There are some states who are more actively involved in dialogue with the expert mechanism than others, and I would welcome the initiative from my former colleague Alexei Sikarev to include also the permanent forum in these discussions. Maybe the forum could be a support for the expert mechanism in promoting those dialogues that are taking a little bit more time than others. And I also remind, remembering the Hannah McGlade's intervention earlier, that there is a possibility to make a country engagement request jointly. And she mentioned the removal of Maori and Aboriginal children. The expert mechanism would be happy to enter into a dialogue with the government of Australia and also other Indigenous peoples representatives in Australia on a possible country engagement in Australia regarding Indigenous children. This is just one example of what our new mandate is, the possibilities it's giving us. I thank everybody for your comments. I will make sure to respond all of them during our session in July, and I hope you all will attend then. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate all of those opportunities. I think we have much to work on. And Mr. Pablomas.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the feedback and the comments that were offered. I want to express from the onset that at the last meeting of the Board of Trustees, one of the items that we contemplated is beginning to think outside of the box in terms of the participation of Indigenous peoples in these various mechanisms and UN bodies. I've taken note of the feedback on the need to be flexible in terms of how the fund may be able to continue supporting both at the national and maybe regional level. And I think in this time of the pandemic as well, this is certainly a priority of the fund. So my assurance to the esteemed delegates that raised the point that the fund will be considering this feedback. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. I want to thank our distinguished speakers for their concluding remarks. It's my pleasure now once again to turn to my colleague, Mr. Vital Bambanzi, to summarize key points from our discussion this morning, both from the panelists and the permanent forum members, as well as this discussion from the nation states and indigenous
Merci,
participants.
chers collègues.
Thank you, Jeffrey, for your leadership. It's been that you've chaired this meeting so well, and it's been very successful. We were interested to hear, and I think my colleague Focal Points raised some of the recommendations, but to summarize what was said this session, many speakers, particularly the Special Rapporteur, noted that he started his mandate in May last year, and that he's worked a lot on trying to gather information on violations of Indigenous rights, particularly working with member states and Indigenous organisations. He underscored that he very found it difficult to fulfill his mandate because of the COVID-19 pandemic, and he's also worked with the previous special rapporteur, and they all focused their work on interactions between states and financial institutions, human rights organizations, and Indigenous peoples organizations in terms of the respecting the rights to land and natural resources, the fight against climate change as well, and also the fight against deforestation, because these are seen as Indigenous lands where Indigenous people can exercise their rights. He also underscored that Indigenous peoples are being criminalized in terms of their exercise of their rights over land and territories. The Special Rapporteur also highlighted as one of the priorities focusing on the respect for human rights, the right to land for Indigenous peoples and access to water, and particularly looking at the responses to COVID-19 in collaboration indeed with the different stakeholders, each in their own area. The Special Rapporteur is planning visits to Denmark and Finland, and also in countries in Africa and Asia. As contained in his mandate, he urges states to send invitations out because he can't carry out his mandate or plan visits to states without being first invited to do so. He also highlighted that cooperation between different mandates would be a very effective and efficient way of respecting and promoting Indigenous rights and to make this a reality. The chair of MRIP also touched on the problems caused by the COVID-19 pandemic and how that's affected her mandate. But nevertheless, she underscored the very important activities that have been carried out, particularly focusing on children's rights. It was a seminar for that and also a seminar on self-determination. She also touched on the good level of collaboration between the different mandates within the UN, so that the respect and promotion of Indigenous rights be a reality. Our colleague from the Voluntary Fund spoke about the activities that have been undertaken by the fund, including promoting the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and the UN conference, and the first UN conference on Indigenous peoples, and particularly focusing on supporting the participation of different Indigenous peoples within national systems and on Indigenous peoples. We've also noticed I'll just conclude and say that several speakers, whether they be representatives of states or of Indigenous peoples, and other organizations who advocate for Indigenous rights, have underscored that it is necessary to have a good level of cooperation and dialogue on an ongoing basis so that everyone can make a greater contribution, both on a level of states and on a Indigenous organizations level, so that everyone can fully enjoy their rights as a citizens of the world. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Thank you. We're going to wrap up and conclude the meeting in in English and let the interpreters go. I want to thank Mr. Bombonzi for his summary. I would also like to thank our distinguished speakers for joining us this morning and for all their informative and thought-provoking presentations, as well as all participants who intervened from the floor for your active participation. We have thus completed our program of work for this morning. The Permanent Forum will hold its next virtual informal meeting tomorrow, Friday, April 23rd at 9 a.m. Eastern Time to begin its consideration of agenda item number 6, entitled Follow Up to the Outcome Document of the World Conference on Indigenous Peoples and the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. This informal meeting is hereby adjourned.